The ink on the parish registry was already dry, but it was the smell of burning wax and betrayal that filled the room when Clara realized she had not been saved from the ruins of her life. She had merely been traded to a monster. She is standing near the fireplace now. Both hands are wrapped around the marriage contract, and the paper is trembling, though she is doing everything in her power to hold it still. The fire behind her has burned low, reduced to a heap of embers that give off more shadow than light. And the rain, the most relentless, unforgiving Yorkshire rain, is throwing itself against the tall windows of Blackwood Manor, as though it too is furious at what has transpired inside these walls tonight. Across the room, not 3 feet from the desk between them, the Duke of Averen stands in absolute stillness. He is buttoning his riding gloves, slowly, with a deliberate, unhurried precision that is more frightening than any raised voice could be. His face is a mask, not a blank mask. There is intelligence behind it, cold and watchful, but it reveals nothing he does not intend to reveal, and right now he intends to reveal nothing at all. On the desk between them lies a shattered porcelain miniature. It had once been a painted likeness of a golden-haired young man. It is not recognizable as much of anything now. Clara does not look at the pieces. She already knows whose face was on it, and who broke it and why. She breathes, shallow, measured. Her father taught her that long ago, before the strokes took his voice. He told her that a Vance woman breathes when other women faint. She is breathing now. Just barely, she said it quietly, as though speaking it too loudly would let it become real. You already knew. Not a question. It had stopped being a question the moment she walked through the door and found the contract waiting, signed and witnessed, bearing her father's mark. The Duke finished buttoning the second glove, smoothed it across his knuckles, and looked at her. Those eyes, grey as a February sky with no warmth promised behind it, met hers across the dying fire. He did not need to answer. That is where we find them. That is where the ink sits, drying on a page that will alter the course of everything. But to understand how 2 people arrived at this particular moment in this particular room, with this particular wreckage on the desk between them, I need to take you somewhere else entirely. If you have found your way to Whispered Thrones for the first time tonight, I hope you will stay. Press subscribe, settle in, and let me tell you everything. This story has more chambers than the manor it takes place in, and every single one of them holds a secret. Before this night is over, you will have felt all of them. Now let me take you back to where this began, to a time before the ink was spilled, when the sun still shone on the manicured lawns of Hertfordshire, and promises were things spoken in whispers beneath the willow trees, rather than forged in the cold calculus of power. Vance Court in the summer of 1814 had the particular beauty of a thing that does not yet know it is dying. The lawns were still green. The roses against the east wall still climbed in a blaze of deep red and cream. The house itself, modest but handsome, a Georgian property with 12 rooms and an overgrown kitchen garden, sat in its valley as though permanence were something it had earned and no one could revoke. But inside, in the small back parlour that had become the centre of all the family's real business, there was no pretending. Miss Clara Vance sat at the writing desk every morning at 7, before the remaining housemaid had set the breakfast things, and she opened the ledger. The same ledger every morning. The columns of figures were the same figures they had always been, growing no more hopeful with repetition, but she read them anyway, because somebody had to, and there was no one else left to do it. She was 21, and she looked it in the sense that her skin was still unlined, and her dark hair still had the softness of youth. But her eyes had the weight of a woman who had been the head of her household for 2 years, without anyone giving her permission to be. Every evening she trimmed the tallow candles down to the absolute wick before she allowed herself to stop reading. She turned her worn cotton cuffs inside out before she came downstairs, so the fraying at the edges would not be visible to the servants they could no longer reliably pay. These were small things. They were the things no one in the house spoke about aloud, because speaking about them would have required acknowledging what they meant. Her father, Mr. Edward Vance, was confined to his bed on the upper floor, his body partially stilled by the second stroke that had taken him the previous winter. He could understand everything said to him. He could not respond. Clara visited him every afternoon and read to him for an hour. Something pleasant, never harrowing, and then sat with him in the particular silence of people who have run out of practical things to say, and have not yet found their way back to the impractical ones. She did not tell him how bad the accounts had become. She had made that decision 18 months ago, and had not unmade it since. Her younger sister, Lucy, was 16 that summer, all long limbs and unguarded curiosity, the kind of girl who still collected interesting beetles in a jar on her windowsill and had firm opinions about cloud formations. Clara loved her with a fierceness she rarely named, because naming it felt too close to naming what she was afraid of, which was Lucy, thin-wristed and clever and utterly unsuited to the cold life of a governess's hall, being forced into exactly that by the circumstances their father's ambitions had bequeathed them. The canal investments had seemed so certain. Everyone had said so. 3 gentlemen had written letters. There had been a prospectus. There was always a prospectus. By autumn of 1813, the canal company had folded. The secondary investments followed. What remained of the Vance estate was the house, a parcel of unused land in Yorkshire, and debts whose total Clara had memorized like a prayer, because knowing the exact shape of a catastrophe was, she had found, marginally more bearable than letting it remain a vague and shapeless terror. Into this situation, in the spring of 1814, walked Julian Grosvenor. Julian was 26, golden-haired, and possessed of the specific polished beauty of a man who had grown up understanding that rooms changed when he entered them. He was the younger branch of the Grosvenor family, cousin to the Duke of Averen, a connection he mentioned frequently, with a studied casualness that suggested he had practiced until it sounded offhand. He had warm brown eyes and an easy laugh, and a particular refined gift for making a woman feel, within 30 seconds of speaking to him, that he had been thinking about her specifically, and only her for some considerable time. Clara was not a fool. She observed him with the same careful, ledger-minded attention she brought to everything else. She noted that his coat was excellent and his horse better, and that he spoke of his cousin the Duke with a particular combination of warmth and wounded pride. The way one speaks of a family member whose superiority one has made public peace with, while privately finding the arrangement rather trying. She also noted, more practically, that if he were to offer for her, which the frequency of his visits suggested was not outside the realm of possibility, it would solve, in a single document, every problem the ledger contained. It was not a romantic calculation. It was not even a cold calculation. It was simply the arithmetic of survival, dressed in whatever clothes were still presentable. She had worn the presentable clothes to Lady Danbury's mid-season ball on a warm evening in June, with a calm face and a spine like a blade, not knowing that the geometry of her life was about to change entirely. Now I must introduce you to the other man in this story. The man who had been watching that geometry very carefully indeed, from a distance and for much longer than Clara knew. Arthur Vance-Grosvenor, the Duke of Averen, was 32 and had the bearing of a man who considered architecture a personal affront. A sense that every room he entered was slightly too small and slightly too loud, and that he was tolerating it as a concession to the requirements of civilization. He was tall, dark, possessed of a stillness that people at first mistook for calm, and then, upon further acquaintance, recognized as something considerably more controlled, and therefore more unsettling. He had been seen at an estate auction that April. While other lords chatted over the lot listings, Arthur sat in his black lacquered carriage, without moving for 45 minutes, watching the bidders through the window. When the contested parcel came up, he stepped out, spoke an amount in a flat, devastating tone that silenced the crowd, and returned to his carriage. He had not bid a second time because there had been no need. This was, those who knew him would say, entirely characteristic. What they would tell you less readily, because most of them did not know it, was the particular history that had made Arthur Vance-Grosvenor into the specific kind of man who sat in carriages and watched and waited. He was 7 years old when his mother left Averen House for the last time. She had gone with a man described as charming, penniless, warm with an easy laugh and a talent for making a woman feel she was the only person in his thoughts. Arthur had not cried at his mother's departure. He had gone to his lessons. What he had done, with the slow industry of a deeply wounded child, was learn to recognize charm for what it was. A performance, enacted by people who needed things and had found warmth more efficient than honesty. He trusted no warmth. He trusted ledgers, contracts, and the dry, reliable testimony of figures that did not alter their stories, depending on who was in the room. And so, when his private investigations into the Averen estate accounts, conducted for 14 painstaking months, began to point, with increasing and damning clarity, at his cousin Julian, Arthur felt not surprise but the grim recognition of a man who has always known that charm is a mechanism, and has been waiting patiently to see what it was a mechanism for. Julian had been using proxy signatures and falsified investment notices to siphon funds from the family accounts. The amounts were staggering, threaded through the whole construction, as scapegoat, as silencing tool, as legal shield, was the name of a bedridden country squire named Edward Vance, whose signature had been obtained by his charming and frequent visitor, and whose eldest daughter was on the verge of becoming Julian's wife. There was a parcel of land attached to the Vance estate in Yorkshire, unremarkable land apparently, land nobody had thought about in 30 years. Arthur's surveyor had thought about it very recently indeed. The ballroom at Lady Danbury's was everything money and 30 years of aggressive collecting could make it. Gilded mirrors, hothouse flowers, the kind of candlelight that made everyone look like a painting of themselves at their best. The floor was already thick with couples when Clara and Julian arrived, and Julian moved through the room with the fluid ease of a man returning to water. Clara kept her head level and her expression composed and counted the beats of the music under her breath as they navigated the floor, because counting gave her something to do with her mind other than calculate, for the 100th time that week, what the winter would look like if this did not work. She became aware of the Duke through the change in other people. A slight involuntary straightening of backs, a fractional dimming of conversation, the specific alteration of a crowd that has registered someone before whom performance is useless. Then Julian said in her ear, with the affectionate exasperation of a man used to this reaction, "Ah, my cousin has graced us with his presence." She looked. He was standing near the far wall, not dancing, not moving, not performing any of the social mechanics the room around him performed. Watching. His eyes swept the room with the slow, deliberate attention of a man conducting an inventory, and then, before she could look away, they found her. He had pale grey eyes, utterly still. Not unkind, exactly, but not warm either. The eyes of someone who was not going to pretend to find her decorative, which was what every other pair of eyes in this room was doing. The look he gave her lasted perhaps 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, Clara had the unmistakable and appalling sensation that he had seen through the altered dress, and the careful posture and the counted beats directly into the ledger she kept in the back parlour at Vance Court, that he had read every column, and that his assessment was already complete. Julian made the introduction with habitual warmth. Arthur inclined his head, not quite a bow, the minimum courtesy required, and said, without preamble, "I hope your father's accounts are in better order than last quarter. His creditors have been growing impatient." The floor did not fall away. Clara's spine was very straight. "I was not aware my father's accounts were a matter of public interest, Your Grace." "They are a matter of mine," he said simply, and then Julian returned with the punch and the moment passed, or appeared to pass. 30 minutes later, with Julian gone to greet a friend, Arthur was at her elbow as the next dance began. He did not lead her onto the floor. He led her, with a firm and quiet certainty, to a curtained alcove at the edge of the ballroom, and there, with the music playing 8 feet away, he said, "Your suitor spent the equivalent of your remaining dowry at a gaming table in Pickering Street 3 nights ago. Whatever arrangement you believe you are in the process of making, Miss Vance, you are building it on a foundation that does not exist." The music played. Someone laughed, out on the floor. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you are clearly not stupid," he said, "and it would be a waste." He walked away without looking back. She stood in the alcove for 2 full bars of music before she followed, her face giving nothing away to the glittering room. She stored what he had said in the part of her mind that kept important things, and she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of the room she had slept in since childhood, thinking about grey eyes that did not pretend. 3 days later the letter arrived, brief, formal. It informed Miss Clara Vance that the outstanding debts held against the estate of Edward Vance had been acquired by a single private creditor, requiring full settlement within 48 hours. Failing which, foreclosure proceedings against Vance Court would begin immediately. There was no name on the letter. There was a London address. Clara read it once. Then she sat down and read it again. Then she put it flat on the desk and put both hands flat on top of it and breathed, slowly. The way she had taught herself to breathe when the thing happening was too large to respond to immediately. There was no 48 hours. There was no money. There was no Julian, whose dowry, she now understood with complete clarity, had never existed. There was only one address. She arrived at Averen House the following morning in a hired cab she could not afford. She was shown to a small study at the back of the house. Small not because the house lacked larger rooms. The house had rooms large enough to stable carriages in, but because a small study establishes the dimensions of a meeting before it has begun. She understood this immediately. Arthur stood by the window when she entered. He turned. He did not invite her to sit, which meant she had to choose to sit or stand. She stood. "I received your letter," he said. "You sent mine first," she replied. Something moved at the corners of his mouth, not a smile, but acknowledgement. He moved to the desk, where a document was already laid out. "Sit down, Miss Vance. I am going to offer you something rather different from what you were expecting." She did not sit. "Tell me what it is first." He looked at her for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he sat down himself, which rebalanced the room. "I am not interested in your money. I am interested in your hand in marriage. Specifically, I need the betrothal to my cousin legally superseded before Julian can act on what he is currently planning." He slid the document across the desk. She looked at it without touching it. "You want to marry me. I need to acquire the legal connection that will prevent my cousin from completing what he has started using your father's name." "That is not an answer to what I said." He held her gaze. "No," he said. "It is not." Clara Vance stood in that small study and understood for the first time the actual shape of the trap she was in. Not Julian's soft, charming variety. This one, the hard-edged, contract-shaped, irrevocably legal kind. She thought about Lucy's jar of beetles on the windowsill. She thought about her father's silent eyes, tracking her from his pillow, trying to tell her something he could no longer say. She reached out and picked up the contract. She read every word. It took 12 minutes. Arthur sat without speaking and without, she noticed, checking his watch. "I have conditions," she said when she finished. "My sister is settled independently with sufficient income that she never requires anyone's permission for anything. My father receives the best medical care available. I manage the household accounts of whatever property I am placed in." She paused. "And you will tell me, clearly and completely, what my father's signature is actually involved in." A silence. "That last condition," Arthur said, "will require more than one conversation. Then we will have more than one conversation." She left her hand resting on the contract without signing it. Waiting. He looked at her hand, then her face. "Agreed," he said. "It is important to stop here and notice what has just happened, because what has just happened is not a romance. It is two people, one armed with wealth and one armed with nothing except intelligence, and the refusal to lie down, negotiating the terms under which they will occupy the same legal existence. And yet something in that room shifted in those 12 minutes that had nothing to do with the contract on the desk. She had read every word, and he had watched her read them, and neither had felt the need to fill the silence with anything false. Those who have known real loneliness understand why that matters. The weeks that followed brought the wedding and the formal announcements, and Julian, stripped of his prize without warning, was not quiet about it. At a garden party held by the Countess of Harlow, while guests moved between the rose borders with their plates and their parasols, Julian stood up in the middle of the lawn and made a scene. He spoke of tyranny. He said the word love twice, loudly in Clara's direction, looking at her with his warm brown eyes full of anguished appeal. He was very good at it. Clara felt every pair of eyes in that garden land on her at once, distributed like a physical weight across her shoulders. She was being invited, in front of the assembled ton, to perform her own humiliation in one direction or another, flee to Julian and be confirmed as a romantic fool, or stand by the Duke and be confirmed as a mercenary climber. She smoothed the front of her dress. She looked at Julian and said, in a voice that carried exactly as far as necessary, "I am marrying the Duke of Averen of my own choice, Julian. I would be grateful if you would allow the matter to rest." The garden was quiet for a moment that lasted considerably longer than a moment. Julian's warm eyes held hers, and she saw the performance slip, just slightly, the way a mask slips when the wearer forgets to hold it, and beneath it was something cold and calculating that she recognized, because she had been looking at cold and calculating things across desks for 2 years. She had been right to feel that discomfort at the small of her back. But the worst of that summer was still ahead of her. Late in August, with the contract signed and the season ending, a note arrived that sent Clara's world into free fall. Lucy, travelling by hired coach from Hertfordshire to London, had not arrived at the expected hour +2, had not arrived at all. The driver's frantic report said the carriage had been stopped on the North Road, and Lucy had been taken. Clara stood in the entrance hall of Averen House holding the note, and she did not put her hands flat on anything. She stood very still and stopped breathing entirely for a moment that felt very long. Then she found Arthur. He was in his private study with his investigator. When she came through the door without knocking, her face white and her eyes fixed on his, she knew, before she had said a word, that he already knew. The expression on his face in that moment was not guilt, precisely, but the expression of a man who has made a calculation he is no longer certain was correct. "Where is she?" Clara said. "She is safe. A safe house in Highgate. My men are. Where is she?" A pause. "I knew Julian arranged this 2 days ago. I allowed it to proceed to catch his associates in the act which we did approximately an hour ago. She has not been harmed. You used my sister." The words had run out, or rather there were too many, and they jammed behind her teeth. She stood in the middle of his study with her jaw tight and her eyes burning, and said nothing else for a long moment. "You knew, and you let me believe she was gone for 12 hours. He was silent. "You should have told me," she said. "Whatever your reason, however correct your calculation, you should have told me." He did not defend himself. He stood very still, and she watched something shift in that controlled, careful face. Not an expression she could name, but a change, like a door moving on a hinge that has not been used in years, moving reluctantly and not quite closing again. "Lucy will be brought here by morning," he said. "I give you my word." "Your word," Clara said, "is a legal document. That is not what I am asking for." She turned and left the room. "I want to stop here because this is where you need to hold two truths simultaneously. Arthur was wrong not to tell her. That was a failure, not of intelligence, but of something more fundamental. And yet the thing that drove him was not cruelty. He had been tracking Julian for 14 months. He was not going to let charm win again. He had not yet learned, was in the very early, fragile process of learning, that protecting someone and consulting them are not mutually exclusive. Neither of those truths cancels the other. I think you already feel what is coming. Lucy arrived the following morning, bewildered and unhurt, with grass stains on her travelling dress and a firm opinion about the quality of the bread in Highgate. She hugged Clara for a long time in the entrance hall without speaking, and Clara held her sister's slight familiar weight and pressed her mouth into Lucy's hair and did not make a sound. Arthur stood at the top of the stairs and watched this reunion. Then he walked away, quietly, before either of them looked up. 3 days later, Arthur's investigator arrived at Blackwood Manor in Yorkshire with a leather satchel containing the thing Arthur had been building toward for 14 months. The ledgers, the forged ones, the originals alongside them, alterations marked clearly. The proxy signatures, 3 of them, on documents bearing Edward Vance's name that had never been shown to Edward Vance. Clara heard voices behind the library door, knocked and entered without waiting. She had been managing her family's survival for 2 years, and was not in the habit of being kept out of rooms that contained information about her family. The investigator looked at Arthur. Arthur looked at Clara. The satchel was on the desk. "What is in that?" she said. A silence with the quality of a held breath. Then Arthur said, "Sit down, Clara. Not Miss Vance." Her name, for the first time, spoken as though it were simply a word and not a title. She sat down, and he told her everything. He told her about the proxy signatures, about the coal vein beneath the Vance land in Yorkshire, identified by his surveyor in March, learned by Julian 2 weeks later through a household staff member on Julian's private payroll, about the plan constructed quietly over almost a year. Marry Clara, use her father's legal dependency to hold the coal rights, wait for Edward Vance to die, and inherit both land and the silence of a widow with no proof and no recourse. About the fact that this marriage was not the comfortable one. It was the only legal mechanism available to instantly strip Julian of his access to the Vance estate before the fraud was complete. He had attended Lady Danbury's ball because he had needed to see her first, to understand what he was asking of her. Clara listened to all of this without moving. The investigator gathered his satchel and left quietly, which was the correct thing to do. When Arthur had finished, the fire between them had burned down to embers, and the rain was at the windows again. "You decided in June that you were going to marry me," she said slowly. "Yes, without asking me. I bought the debts in July. You came to me. You read the contract and named your conditions. I agreed to them. I did not put a pen in your hand. You left me no other door. Julian left you no other door, he said, his voice very quiet. I was the alternative he did not tell you existed. A long silence. You should have told me all of this at the beginning, she said, at any point. Yes, he said, one word. Not a defense, not a justification. Just yes. And the specific quality of a man who has spent 32 years building walls admitting, for the first time in a very long time, that a wall was the wrong structure for the situation. She looked at him. This contained, complicated man sitting across from her with the evidence of her family's near destruction on the desk between them, his grey eyes watching her with an expression that was not a mask. That was not the inventory look from the ballroom, but something else, something undefended. And she made a decision. Not yet. She was not ready yet. The storm broke over Blackwood Manor that night in full force. By 10 o'clock the rain came sideways off the moors, windows rattling in their frames, fires roaring in every grate. Julian arrived at 11. He came up the front drive without announcement, shown into the entrance hall by a footman not yet given instructions about such visitors, and by the time anyone thought to alert the Duke, Julian was standing in the centre of the great marble floor, looking up the grand staircase with the expression of a man who has decided the performance must be given regardless of audience. Clara heard him from the landing. She came down before anyone could stop her. He looked at her with those warm, practiced eyes and said everything he had always planned to say, in the tone he had always planned to say it, that he had come to save her, that it was not too late, that he had loved her from the beginning, that the Duke was a cold and calculating tyrant who had stolen her life, and that she owed it to herself, to the woman she really was, to leave with him tonight. He said it very well. He had always said things very well. At the top of the stairs, Arthur stood in the shadows. He had been there since Julian began speaking. He did not come down. He did not intervene. He stood very still with his arms at his sides, and waited, and whatever was happening in his chest in that moment was not visible on his face, but it was there. Clara let Julian finish. She gave him the complete version without interruption. Then she said, "Enough." She stood at the foot of the stairs with the fire behind her, and her voice carried nothing false. "Enough, Julian. Do not speak to me of love when your pockets are lined with my father's ruin. Every pretty speech you have made since April has been the voice of a man counting the coal beneath my family's land, and I will not stand in this house and pretend otherwise." She looked up at Arthur, standing in his silence at the top of the stairs. "And do not look at me with such pity, your grace, from your high and lonely tower. You thought you bought a silent doll to balance your ledgers, but you have married a woman who sees you completely. I see the wound in you that made you this way, and I see what you tried to do with it, and I will not forgive you simply because your reasons were better than his. I will stay in this house. I will bear your name, but I will never be your victim, and I will never be his prize, and the next man who speaks to me of love had better mean something more honest by the word than either of you have managed tonight." The entrance hall held its breath. She bent down and removed the wedding ring from her finger. She placed it on the marble floor at Julian's feet. It made a small, clean sound. Then she turned her back on both of them and walked up the grand staircase. Her spine was straight, her head was level, her hands did not tremble at her sides. She disappeared into the shadows of the upper floor without looking back. Julian stood on the marble with the ring at his feet. He looked at it. He looked up at Arthur. Something in Arthur's face stopped whatever Julian had been about to say. He turned and left the way he had come. Arthur descended the stairs alone. He stood at the bottom and looked at the ring on the floor. Then he bent and picked it up. He straightened and looked up the staircase at the empty space where Clara had been, and his face, in front of no one, with no performance required, with no audience to manage his image for, did not hold itself in order. His jaw was tight, his eyes were very bright. The certainty that had carried him for 32 years, the cold architecture of it, the careful, constructed invulnerability, had simply, quietly, and completely stopped working. In that quiet shattering of illusions, the Duke realized he had not trapped a helpless bird. He had invited a queen into his fortress, and she had just taken the throne. In the days that followed, something changed at Blackwood Manor that had nothing to do with legal documents and everything to do with the atmosphere of the house. Clara did not ask anyone's permission for anything. She spoke with the housekeeper, the cook, and the head groom with a natural authority that produced what real authority always produces. Competent people, relieved to be competently directed, simply getting on with the work. She opened the estate ledgers because she sat down one morning and opened them, and the steward who found her an hour later looked reflexively toward the door, calculating whether to fetch the Duke. Then looked at her face, pulled up a chair, and answered her questions. Arthur watched all of this without interfering, with a specific sensation accumulating in his chest, for which he did not yet have a name, and which felt nothing like any ledger entry he had ever made. He went to his solicitor. He had 2 documents prepared in 12 hours, because he was a duke, and 12 hours was what he required when he decided something needed doing. He came to her dressing room on a Tuesday morning and knocked on the door like a visitor uncertain of their welcome, which was a thing he had never done in his own house before. She opened it and looked at him with her careful, assessing eyes. He said, "May I come in?" Not a question precisely, but said like one. She stepped back. He placed 2 documents on her dressing table. The first, the unconditional deed of Vance Court and the Yorkshire coal lands, transferred irrevocably into the sole name of Miss Lucy Vance, with no reversion clause. The second, a deed of separation, cleanly drafted, granting Clara full freedom to leave the marriage with her reputation intact, and her sister's future secured, if that was what she chose. "I am not offering these to make you stay," he said. "I am offering them because you should never have been without them, and because if you leave, it should not be because you had no choice but to stay." He left the documents on the table. He left the room. Clara stood alone in the quiet of her dressing room and looked at those 2 pieces of paper for a very long time. She thought about Julian, who had offered her everything and meant none of it. She thought about Arthur, who had offered her nothing pretty, and had now, in private, with no witnesses and no social performance required, stripped himself of every piece of leverage he possessed. She thought about grey eyes that did not pretend. The charges against Julian were brought through proper channels the following week, quietly and without fanfare, the way Arthur preferred. Julian was offered 2 choices: quiet exile to the colonies with a modest income, or public criminal prosecution that would drag the Grosvenor name through the courts alongside his own. He took the ship. He did not write any farewell letters, charming or otherwise. The Yorkshire autumn came early that year, which people in the county said was a sign of a hard winter. Clara suspected it was simply the way Yorkshire behaved, sudden and uncompromising, and more beautiful than it had any right to be when the light came through correctly. Her father, attended now by 2 physicians from York, had not regained his speech. But one morning in October, Clara came in and read to him as she always did, and when she looked up at the end of the chapter, he was watching her with an expression she recognized as peace. Not the resigned peace of a man who has given up, but the specific peace of a father who has watched his daughter navigate an impossible situation and find herself still standing on the other side of it. She put the book down and held his hand without reading anything at all. Lucy, settled and financially independent by the terms of the deed, was doing what Lucy had always done best, filling whatever room she was in with an uncomplicated, vibrant joy that reminded everyone around her that the world contained things worth noticing, including beetles. And Arthur was learning something he had not tried to learn since the age of 7, which was that armor could come off, room by room, without the whole structure collapsing. He was learning it slowly, with the difficulty of a man who built his fortress with great care, and is now dismantling it carefully. The process was neither fast nor graceful, but it was happening. On a morning in late October, when the sun broke unexpectedly through the low Yorkshire clouds and turned the moor grass briefly, improbably golden, Clara walked out onto the terrace and found Arthur already there. He was standing at the stone railing, looking out at the land. He heard her step and turned. He did not speak. He held out his hand, open, uncovered. She looked at it. She looked at his face, which was not performing anything. She put her hand in his. Their fingers interlocked, and there was no contract between them, no ledger, no leverage, and no debt. Only the morning and the light, and two people who had found each other through the hardest possible route and discovered, at the end of it, that the difficulty had not been wasted. We often seek the warmth of a charming promise, forgetting that the brightest fires burn out, leaving nothing but ash. It is in the quiet, unyielding shelter of a love that stands against the winter that we truly find our home. Clara sought only to save her family from the storm, and in doing so she taught a king how to bow before his queen. If this tale of hidden hearts and earned devotion brought a little warmth to your day, I hope you will press that subscribe button and join our court of whispers. Every week we return to these candlelit rooms and impossible choices, and people who find each other through the wreckage of their circumstances. And I would very much like you here for all of it. If you do not subscribe, my dear friend, I am afraid you owe me a favour, one I will collect eventually. Until next time, remember that the coldest armour often hides the fiercest heart, and sometimes, if you are willing to hold out your hand without knowing what it costs you, that heart will reach back.